Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. So I'm sitting here at 3 a.m. writing this because I can't sleep, and honestly, I don't think I'll ever look at my driveway the same way again. 3 weeks ago, I was just another 28-year-old guy working customer service for a cable company in suburban Phoenix, living alone in my dad's old rental house after he passed last year. The place isn't much, 2 bedrooms, peeling paint on the shutters, and a front yard that's more dirt than grass. But it's mine now, and the mortgage payments keep me busy enough that I don't think too much about how quiet it gets at night. I'd been settling into this routine of work, Netflix, and the occasional beer with my neighbor Jeff when everything went sideways. Life was predictable, maybe even boring, but looking back now, boring sounds pretty damn good. It was a Tuesday evening in late October when Trevor knocked on my door. I hadn't seen the guy since we graduated Westview High 10 years ago, but there he was on my porch, that same crooked grin and shaggy brown hair, though he looked thinner than I remembered, almost gaunt. He was wearing this beat-up leather jacket that had seen better days and jeans with holes that didn't look intentional. "Hey man, long time no see," he said, like we'd just talked yesterday instead of a decade ago. Something about his eyes seemed different though. They kept darting around, never quite meeting mine for more than a second. He had this nervous energy, shifting his weight from foot to foot, and when he smiled, it didn't reach those restless eyes. I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd stop by. Mind if I come in? I could really use a friend right now. The way he said it, with this underlying urgency that I couldn't quite place, should have been my first warning. We ended up on my couch with a couple of beers, and Trevor spun me this story about how he'd been living in Las Vegas, working construction. But things had gone south with his girlfriend and he needed a place to crash for just a few days while he figured things out. He kept checking his phone every few minutes, and whenever a car drove by outside, he'd glance toward the window with this tense expression. "You know how it is, man," he said, taking a long pull from his beer. "Sometimes you just need to disappear for a while, let things cool down." When I asked what kind of things, he got vague, mumbling about drama and people who don't know when to let things go. The whole conversation had this weird undercurrent, like he was telling me a story with half the details missing. But we'd been friends once, shared classes and lunch tables, and I guess I felt like I owed him something from those days when we were both just kids trying to figure out who we were. By the time we finished our third beer, Trevor was already making himself comfortable, tossing his worn duffel bag in the corner, and asking where I kept the extra blankets. I told him the couch was his for a few days, ignoring the little voice in my head that was screaming about how this whole situation was weird. He seemed relieved in a way that went beyond just having a place to sleep, like he'd been holding his breath for weeks and could finally exhale. "Thanks, buddy," he said, and for a moment his smile looked genuine. "I really owe you one. This is just temporary, I promise." That night I went to bed thinking I was doing a good deed for an old friend, maybe even feeling a little good about myself for being the kind of person who'd help someone out. If I'd known what was coming, I would have driven him to a motel myself and paid for the room. The first few days were actually pretty normal, or at least what I convinced myself was normal. Trevor would be gone most of the day. He said he was job hunting and taking care of business, and he'd come back around dinner time with takeout or groceries, always paying cash and always seeming a little more on edge than when he'd left. He had this habit of parking his beat-up Ford Taurus at the end of the block instead of in my driveway, which he claimed was just being considerate about not blocking me in. But I noticed he always positioned it where he could see both ends of the street from my living room window. At night, he'd stay up late scrolling through his phone with the brightness turned way down, and more than once I caught him peeking through the blinds at cars that drove by too slowly. When I asked if everything was okay, he'd just shrug and say he was a light sleeper. That city living had made him paranoid about break-ins. On Friday morning, I woke up to find Trevor sitting at my kitchen table, fully dressed, and looking like he hadn't slept at all. His hair was messy, and there were dark circles under his eyes that made him look older, almost haggard. "Hey, I need a huge favor," he said, before I'd even had my coffee. "My car's making this weird noise, and I've got this appointment across town that I absolutely cannot miss. Could I borrow yours for a few hours?" He gestured toward my 2018 Toyota Camry sitting in the driveway, the one reliable thing I owned outright. The way he asked wasn't really asking. There was this desperate edge to his voice that made it clear this wasn't optional. "It's really important, man. I'll have it back by noon, I swear." Part of me wanted to say no, but the guy looked genuinely stressed, and after letting him crash for almost a week, it seemed petty to refuse. I tossed him my keys and told him to be careful, watching from the window as he adjusted the mirrors and seat like he was preparing for a long drive, not a quick trip across town. Noon came and went, then 2 p.m., then 4 p.m. I tried calling Trevor's phone, but it went straight to voicemail every time. Not even ringing, just that immediate click to the generic message. By evening, I was pacing around my house, alternating between annoyance and genuine worry. Maybe his appointment had run long, maybe the car had broken down, maybe a dozen different innocent explanations. But as the hours dragged on, that sick feeling in my stomach grew stronger. I kept thinking about how he'd been acting all week, the way he watched the street, the cash payments, the vague answers about his situation in Vegas. Around 10 p.m., I finally called my insurance company to report the car as potentially stolen, though I felt ridiculous doing it. The representative asked if I wanted to file a police report, and I hesitated. Trevor was supposed to be my friend, right? But by midnight, with still no word and my car completely missing, I was starting to face the possibility that I'd been played from the very beginning. I barely slept that night, checking my phone every few minutes and looking out the window like Trevor might just pull up and apologize for being late. Saturday morning dragged by with no news, and I spent most of it calling local hospitals and even checking jail records online, telling myself I was being thorough rather than paranoid. That evening, I was sitting on my couch with a beer, trying to decide whether to officially report the car stolen, when I heard the familiar sound of my Camry's engine pulling into the driveway. Relief washed over me so fast it made me dizzy. Trevor was back, probably with some crazy story about getting lost or his phone dying. I walked to the front door, ready to give him hell for making me worry, but when I looked through the peephole, my relief turned to confusion. Trevor was getting out of the driver's seat, but there was someone with him. A woman I'd never seen before, tall and blonde, wearing dark sunglasses even though the sun was setting. They were both looking around nervously, and Trevor kept glancing back at the street like they might have been followed. I opened the door before they could knock, and Trevor's face immediately shifted into this forced casual expression that didn't fool anyone. "Hey buddy, sorry I'm late," he said, like being gone for over 24 hours was just a minor inconvenience. "This is Amanda, my friend from Vegas. She drove down to help me with some stuff." Amanda barely acknowledged me, just nodded once and kept scanning the neighborhood behind those dark glasses. She had this sharp, angular face and moved with the kind of nervous energy that made me think of a cat ready to bolt. Trevor was talking fast, explaining something about car trouble and having to wait for parts, but I wasn't really listening because I was noticing other things, like how Amanda kept one hand in her oversized purse, how both of them looked like they hadn't showered in days, and how my car's backseat was now filled with plastic bags and what looked like camping gear. "We just need to grab my stuff and we'll be out of your hair," Trevor said, already walking toward the house without waiting for an invitation. "Thanks for being so cool about everything, man. You're a real lifesaver." But I wasn't feeling cool about anything anymore. As they walked past me into my house, I caught a whiff of something metallic and sharp, like burnt rubber mixed with something I couldn't identify. Amanda went straight to the bathroom without a word, and I heard the door lock behind her. Trevor was shoving his belongings into his duffel bag with shaking hands, moving faster than necessary, and when I asked where they'd been, He just mumbled something about handling business in Tucson. That's when I noticed the scratches on his knuckles and what looked like a small cut on his cheek that definitely hadn't been there when he left. My car keys were still in his pocket, and when I held out my hand for them, he hesitated for just a second too long. "Yeah, of course," he said, finally dropping them into my palm. "Thanks again for letting me borrow it. Really saved my ass." The keys were warm and sticky, and I realized I didn't want to know why. Something was very wrong here, and every instinct I had was telling me to get these people out of my house as quickly as possible. Sunday morning, I woke up to the sound of car doors slamming and engines starting. Through my bedroom window, I watched Trevor and Amanda speed away in his Ford Taurus, leaving behind nothing but tire marks and the lingering smell of cigarettes and fear. I should have been relieved, but instead I spent the morning walking around my house noticing things that were off. How they'd left the bathroom window cracked open, how there were muddy footprints tracked through my kitchen that definitely weren't mine, and how my car now had an almost empty gas tank despite Trevor claiming he'd only driven across town. I found a crumpled receipt in my driveway from a gas station in Flagstaff, which was 3 hours north of Phoenix, and nowhere near where he'd said he was going. When I checked my car more thoroughly, I discovered a small dent in the rear bumper and what looked like blue paint transfer that matched the color of police cruisers. My hands were trembling as I stood there in my driveway, putting together pieces of a puzzle I desperately didn't want to solve. Monday morning at 7:30 a.m., 3 police cars pulled up to my house with their lights flashing but no sirens. I was drinking coffee in my kitchen when I saw them through the window, and my first thought was that something had happened to one of my neighbors. Then Detective Lisa Morrison knocked on my door, badge in hand, asking if I knew Trevor Jameson and when I'd last seen him. That's when she told me that Trevor was wanted in connection with an armed robbery in Las Vegas 2 weeks ago, and that my car had been spotted on security cameras at 2 different crime scenes over the weekend, one at a convenience store in Flagstaff and another at a gas station in Sedona. "We have reason to believe you may have unknowingly assisted a fugitive," she said, and suddenly everything clicked into place like the world's most terrifying jigsaw puzzle. I told them everything, how Trevor had shown up out of nowhere, his nervous behavior, borrowing my car, Amanda, all of it. They impounded my Camry for evidence and told me I'd need to come down to the station for a formal statement. As I watched them load my car onto a tow truck, I realized that my boring, predictable life had just become evidence in a criminal investigation, and I'd never been so grateful to be considered a victim rather than an accomplice. Last spring, when I was 17 and living with my Aunt Catherine in Cedar Falls, something happened that still keeps me up at night. It was late March, right before Easter break, and the weather had just started warming up after what felt like the longest winter of my life. At the time, I was a junior at Westfield High, spending most of my free time with my 3 closest friends, Chloe, Vanessa, and Brooklyn. We'd known each other since middle school, and had this tight bond that came from being the weird kids who preferred horror movies and ghost stories over typical teenage drama. My parents had moved to Denver the year before for their careers, leaving me with Aunt Catherine, who was honestly the coolest guardian a teenager could ask for. She worked night shifts at the local hospital, which meant our house became the unofficial hangout spot for weekend sleepovers and late-night movie marathons. The whole thing started because Brooklyn had just inherited this old Victorian house from her great-aunt Millicent, who'd passed away that February. The house sat on the edge of town, surrounded by overgrown hedges and towering oak trees that made it look like something straight out of a Gothic novel. Brooklyn's parents were planning to sell it, but they'd given her permission to go through the belongings first to see if there was anything worth keeping. None of us had been inside yet, but we'd driven past it countless times, always daring each other to sneak onto the property. The neighbors whispered about strange noises coming from the basement at night, and there were rumors that old Millicent had been into some pretty weird stuff before she died. When Brooklyn suggested we spend Friday night exploring the place, it felt like the perfect opportunity for an adventure. We were all craving something exciting, something that would give us stories to tell for years to come. That Friday evening, we packed our usual sleepover supplies: sleeping bags, snacks, and of course, Chloe's camera equipment, because she was obsessed with documenting everything for her YouTube channel. The plan was simple: meet at my place around 7, grab some dinner, then head to the house once it got dark. Brooklyn had gotten the keys from her parents earlier that week, along with a stern warning about being careful and not staying too late. But honestly, we were 17 and invincible in that stupid way teenagers are, and the warnings just made the whole thing seem more thrilling. When we pulled up to the house around 9 p.m., the first thing that hit us was the smell. This thick, musty odor that seemed to seep through the car windows even before we opened the doors. It was like wet earth mixed with something sweet and rotten, the kind of smell that makes your nose wrinkle and sticks in your throat. Vanessa immediately started complaining about it, but Brooklyn just laughed and said it was probably just old wood and mildew from being closed up for months. The house itself was even more imposing up close than it had seemed from the road. 3 stories of dark wood and chipped paint, with boarded-up windows on the second floor, and a wraparound porch that sagged under the weight of years of neglect. The front door was this massive oak thing with intricate carvings that looked almost Celtic, and when Brooklyn turned the key, it groaned open like something out of a horror movie. The inside was exactly what we'd expected: dusty furniture covered in white sheets, family portraits with eyes that seemed to follow you, and that same overwhelming smell of decay and abandonment. We spent the first hour just wandering around the main floor, filming everything and making jokes to cover up the fact that we were all a little creeped out. The kitchen still had dishes in the sink, like Millicent had just stepped out for a moment, and the living room was filled with strange artifacts: crystals, dried herbs hanging from the ceiling, and books with titles in languages none of us recognized. But it was Chloe who first mentioned the basement door, this heavy wooden thing tucked under the main staircase with at least 3 different locks on it. Brooklyn had brought a whole ring of keys, but it took us nearly 20 minutes to figure out which ones opened the basement locks. The smell got stronger as we worked on the door, and by the time we finally got it open, Vanessa was already talking about maybe calling it a night. But the rest of us were too curious to back down now, especially when we saw those steep wooden stairs disappearing into complete darkness below. The basement was larger than any of us had expected, with multiple rooms branching off from a central area that had these low, arched ceilings that made everything feel cramped and oppressive. Our phone flashlights barely cut through the gloom, creating these weird shadows that danced across the walls every time we moved. The main room was filled with more of Millicent's collection: jars of preserved things we couldn't identify, more books, and what looked like altars or shrines set up in each corner. But it was the smaller room at the back that really caught our attention, the one with the door that was painted completely black and had symbols carved deep into the wood. When we finally got that door open, the first thing we noticed was how much warmer it was inside, like the room had its own heating system even though we hadn't seen any vents or radiators. The walls were covered in these intricate carvings that spiraled from floor to ceiling, symbols and figures that hurt to look at directly, and seemed to shift when you weren't focusing on them. In the center of the room was this circular stone platform, maybe 4 feet across, with channels carved into its surface that led to small holes around the edges. The whole thing was stained with something dark that had seeped into the stone over time, and there were candle stubs arranged around the perimeter, their wax melted and pooled in weird patterns. Chloe was filming everything, getting close-ups of the carvings and asking Brooklyn if her great-aunt had ever mentioned anything about this room. But Brooklyn just shook her head, wide-eyed, saying she'd never heard about any of this before. The air in there felt thick and electric, like right before a thunderstorm, and we all noticed how our phones kept glitching. The camera would freeze, the flashlight would flicker, and the battery percentages kept jumping around randomly. That's when Vanessa started getting really uncomfortable, saying we should probably head back upstairs and maybe come back during the day when we could see things better. But Chloe was in full documentary mode now, convinced she'd stumbled onto something that would make her channel famous, and she kept pushing for us to stay longer and explore more. Brooklyn was torn between curiosity and unease, running her fingers along the carved walls and muttering about how her parents had never mentioned any of this when they gave her the keys. The temperature in the room seemed to keep rising, and we all started shedding our jackets and sweaters. But the warmth felt wrong somehow, not like regular heat, but something that came from inside your skin. Around midnight, we heard our first sound from upstairs. Just footsteps, slow and deliberate, crossing the main floor above us. We all went silent, straining to listen, but the sounds stopped as suddenly as they'd started. Chloe immediately suggested it was just the old house settling, but the footsteps had been too rhythmic, too purposeful to be random creaking. That's when the arguing started, with Vanessa insisting we leave immediately and Chloe demanding we stay to investigate. The compromise we reached was probably the stupidest decision any of us had ever made, but at the time, it seemed reasonable. Chloe announced she was staying the night no matter what, determined to debunk the myths and capture any paranormal activity on film. She'd brought a sleeping bag specifically for this possibility, and her mind was made up. Vanessa and Brooklyn decided they'd stay too, not wanting to leave Chloe alone, but they wanted to set up camp in the main basement area rather than in the carved room. I should have insisted we all leave together, should have trusted the sick feeling that had been growing in my stomach since we'd opened that black door. Instead, I agreed to stay, partly out of loyalty and partly because I was curious too. We spent the next hour moving our stuff downstairs and arranging our sleeping bags in a circle near the bottom of the basement stairs, far enough from the carved room that we couldn't feel that unnatural heat. Chloe set up her camera on a tripod pointing toward the black door, and we settled in to wait. The footsteps upstairs started again around 1 a.m., more frequent now, sometimes accompanied by what sounded like furniture being moved around. But we were committed to our plan, and teenage pride is a powerful thing. What happened next still doesn't make complete sense to me, even now. Around 2 a.m., we all started getting incredibly drowsy at the same time, like someone had slipped us sleeping pills. One minute we were whispering and giggling nervously, and the next minute I could barely keep my eyes open. Vanessa was the first to fall asleep, curled up in her sleeping bag and breathing deeply within minutes. Brooklyn followed soon after, and I remember fighting against the overwhelming urge to just let my eyelids close. The last thing I saw before unconsciousness took me was Chloe, still sitting up with her camera, muttering something about how weird it was that we were all so tired. When I woke up, sunlight was streaming through the small basement windows, and my body ached like I'd been sleeping on concrete for a week. My mouth was dry, my head was pounding, and there was this metallic taste on my tongue that reminded me of blood. Vanessa and Brooklyn were still asleep in their bags, but when I looked toward Chloe's spot, her sleeping bag was empty. Her camera was still on the tripod, still pointing at that black door, but Chloe was nowhere to be seen. I shook Vanessa and Brooklyn awake, and we spent the next 20 minutes calling Chloe's name and searching every corner of the basement. Her phone was still in her sleeping bag, along with her jacket and shoes, but she was just gone. The carved room was exactly as we'd left it, except the air inside was cooler now, back to normal temperature, and some of the candle stubs around the stone platform looked like they'd been recently lit. There were fresh drips of wax that hadn't been there the night before. We checked the basement stairs, thinking maybe she'd gone upstairs to use the bathroom, but the heavy door at the top was still locked from the inside, exactly as we'd left it. It was physically impossible for her to have gotten out that way without the key, which Brooklyn still had in her pocket. We started panicking then, really panicking, calling her parents and then the police, trying to explain how our friend had vanished from a locked basement overnight. The cops who responded were skeptical at first, clearly thinking we were just covering for some teenage drama. But when they searched the house themselves and couldn't find any other way out of the basement, their attitudes changed completely. They brought in search dogs, crime scene investigators, the works. But after 3 days of intensive searching, they had to admit they had no idea what had happened to Chloe. The investigation went on for weeks, but eventually the case went cold. Chloe's parents hired private investigators, put up missing person posters all over town, and even brought in some kind of psychic who claimed the house had negative energy. Brooklyn's parents immediately put the property up for sale, but after everything that happened, no one wanted to buy it. The house still sits empty, and I drive past it sometimes, always wondering what really happened that night. The three of us who were there, Vanessa, Brooklyn, and me, we don't talk about it anymore. We tried for a while comparing our memories and trying to make sense of things, but it just made us all more anxious and paranoid. We're graduating next month, and we'll probably never see each other again after that, which is probably for the best. But here's the thing that really gets to me. The detail I've never told anyone until now. When we watched Chloe's camera footage later, trying to find clues about what happened, the last thing recorded was her walking toward that carved room around 3 a.m. She was moving slowly, almost like she was sleepwalking, and right before she disappeared into the darkness beyond the camera's range, she turned and looked directly at the lens. Her expression was completely blank, but her mouth was moving like she was saying something. We played it back dozens of times, but we could never make out the words. The camera shut off right after that, and Chloe was never seen again. People say you always know when something's wrong, but that's not true. Sometimes it hits you in pieces, and by the time you understand what you're part of, it's already too late to walk it back. Back then, I lived alone in a small duplex just outside of Louisville, Kentucky. I worked night shifts at a printing warehouse and mostly kept to myself. I wasn't particularly close with my family, except for my older brother, Caleb. He was 2 years older than me, a bit wild growing up, but we'd always had each other's backs no matter what. He could make a room feel like chaos and comfort at the same time. One of those people who could talk their way out of anything. And that night, he tried to. It was around 2:20 in the morning when my phone lit up. I remember the exact time because I'd just microwaved some leftover wings and sat down on the couch with a blanket still half folded from the night before. Caleb's name popped up and I picked up immediately, expecting something dumb or drunk or both. But the first thing I heard was breathing, shaky, uneven, not like him at all. Then he said, "I need you to tell the cops I was with you all night." No hello, no joke, just that. I laughed, thinking it was some weird prank or maybe he'd gotten into trouble at a bar again. But he didn't laugh back. His voice was strained. "Please, trust me. Say I was at your place tonight. I need you to say that." I didn't ask why. I just said yes. 5 minutes later, I was still staring at my phone when I saw the red and blue flash through the closed blinds. A patrol car was parked outside Caleb's apartment. He lived 3 blocks down. That's when it started to feel wrong. Not scary, not yet, just sharp. Like I was suddenly too aware of everything. The creak of my fridge, the streetlight buzzing outside, the fact that I hadn't actually seen Caleb in over a week. I walked to the front window and watched the car. 2 officers got out. One of them was knocking on Caleb's door while the other stood near the trunk of his car, which was parked unevenly along the curb. The car was still running. The engine cut off a few minutes later. I don't know if Caleb was inside or not because I never saw him. The cops didn't stay long, maybe 10 minutes, then drove off. I thought that was it. I figured he'd gotten into some sort of bar fight or maybe a DUI scare and just didn't want it to get worse. I didn't sleep much that night. The next day, I got a knock at my door. 2 detectives, plain clothes, polite but firm. They asked if I'd seen my brother the night before. I said yeah, he'd been at my place all evening, just like he asked me to. They exchanged a quick glance. Then one of them asked, "What time did he leave?" I fumbled. I hadn't thought that far ahead. I said something about midnight. They nodded, thanked me, and left without pushing. But once the door shut, my heart started racing for real. I grabbed my phone and tried calling Caleb. No answer. I sent a text. They came to my place. What's going on? Nothing. That silence stretched the entire day. Around 6 p.m., I decided to walk to his place. His car was still there, same spot as the night before, but this time the trunk was closed and locked. I knocked. No response. I let myself in. He'd given me a spare key a year earlier when he got locked out once. The apartment was quiet, clean, almost too clean. No dishes in the sink, no jacket by the door. But his phone was charging on the counter, screen lit up with missed calls, including mine. I stood there staring at his phone for a long time, trying to decide what felt worse, the fact that he hadn't taken it with him, or that he clearly hadn't wanted to talk. I wandered into the hallway, past the half-open bathroom door, into his bedroom. Nothing looked disturbed. Bed made, closet closed. But I remember stopping at the dresser. There was this photo of us from when we were kids, taken at our grandma's old trailer. It had been moved, not just dust shifted, turned around like he didn't want to see it anymore. That's when I started feeling something new. Not panic, not yet. Just this creeping sense that I'd lied too quickly. That maybe I should have asked more before saying yes. The next morning, everything blew up. A woman named Danielle Conrad had been reported missing. 27. Lived on Caleb Street, just 4 houses down. The news mentioned her name like everyone should know it. I didn't, but I recognized her face from somewhere. After a while, I remembered she worked part-time at the gas station near the warehouse where I did my night shifts. Always wore those heavy rings on every other finger, and chewed pink gum that smelled like strawberry chemicals. I'd seen her laugh with customers, but never with employees. Quiet, but not shy. She hadn't shown up to work that morning, or answered calls. Her car was still parked in her driveway, no forced entry at her place. What made my chest tighten was the timeline. The last time anyone had seen her was around 10 p.m. the night Caleb called me. Witnesses said she'd gotten home from a shift and was carrying groceries inside. No screams, no noise, just vanished. The police released a statement that they were searching the area and interviewing residents. I read every word twice, then a third time. That's when I remembered Caleb's voice, how hoarse it had sounded, how specific his words were. Tell them I was with you all night. Not, I need help, not, I messed up. Just, lie for me. That evening, I sat in my car across the street from Caleb's place, engine off, hands gripping the steering wheel. It had been over 36 hours since I'd heard his voice. His car was still parked outside, but there was something different about it this time. The back bumper had what looked like dried mud streaked across the lower edge, like someone had driven through a ditch or a field. Caleb hated getting his car dirty. He used to complain if a single leaf stuck to the windshield. I stared at the trunk. Something about it just hovered in my mind. I knew it was locked, but I couldn't shake the image of him standing there the night he called me, closing it quickly, his face pale in the dark. The next morning, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. It was Caleb. He sounded like he hadn't slept. "Don't ask me anything," he said. "You're not involved. I'm going away for a while. Just forget about it." I asked where he was. He hung up. That was the last time I heard his voice. 3 days later, the police found Danielle's body in a drainage tunnel behind an abandoned storage lot 2 towns over. No public details, just that it was a suspicious death, and that they were looking into persons of interest. Caleb's apartment had been searched, his car taken in for evidence. I didn't tell them about the call. I told them he hadn't contacted me since that night. The guilt didn't hit all at once. It came in waves, mostly late at night when the house creaked or a siren echoed in the distance. I kept thinking about the trunk, about how fast I said yes without knowing what I was covering for. What scares me the most is how easily the lie came out of my mouth when the detectives knocked, like I'd rehearsed it. I started avoiding the neighborhood, even changed shifts at work so I wouldn't drive past that street. Every few months I'd check online to see if Caleb's name ever came up. It hasn't. It's like he evaporated, and no one talks about Danielle anymore. A part of me still thinks maybe I misunderstood everything, that maybe there was some terrible coincidence, and Caleb really didn't do anything. But then I remember his voice. Not the words, his voice. It was like someone who knew a door had just closed behind him for good. I haven't told anyone what really happened that night. Not my coworkers, not my parents, not even the girl I've been seeing for the past year. But I think about it all the time. I said yes, that's the part I can't ever shake. The music from Murphy's bar was still pounding in my ears when I stepped outside at 1:47 a.m. on that Saturday night in November 2023. I'm a junior at State University studying psychology, and I just spent the entire evening celebrating my roommate Jessica's 21st birthday with way too many Cosmos and not nearly enough food. The November air cut right through my thin jacket, making me realize just how underdressed I was for the walk home. My phone showed 12% battery, which should have been my first warning sign, but all I could think about was getting back to my dorm room and collapsing into bed. Jessica had already disappeared with some guy from her statistics class, leaving me standing alone on the sidewalk trying to steady myself against the brick wall. The street was mostly empty, except for a few other college kids stumbling toward the late-night pizza place next door. I opened the rideshare app on my phone, watching the little cars move around the map while I shivered in my mini dress and heels. The estimated wait time was 12 minutes, which felt like forever when you're standing alone downtown at nearly 2 a.m. I remember thinking about how my psychology professor always warned us about situational awareness and decision fatigue, concepts that seemed so academic in the classroom but suddenly felt very real. The app showed my driver would be in a black Honda Accord, license plate ending in 847, and his name was Michael with a 4.9-star rating. I was scrolling through his reviews, reading comments about how punctual and friendly he was, when a black sedan pulled up to the curb right in front of me. Without even thinking twice, I grabbed the door handle and slid into the back seat, grateful to be out of the cold. The interior smelled like vanilla air freshener mixed with something else I couldn't quite place. "Hey, thanks for picking me up so fast," I said, buckling my seatbelt as I settled into the leather seats. The driver was a middle-aged white guy with graying hair at his temples, wearing a navy polo shirt that looked freshly pressed even at this hour. He had kind eyes in the rearview mirror and nodded politely when I thanked him. "No problem at all, miss. University dorms, right?" His voice was calm and professional, exactly what you'd expect from a highly rated driver. I confirmed my destination and pulled out my phone to check the route on the app, but the screen was already dimming as my battery dropped to 8%. The car pulled away from the curb smoothly, and I leaned back against the headrest, finally allowing myself to relax after a long night of socializing and pretending to enjoy shots that tasted like nail polish remover. The first few minutes of the ride were perfectly normal. We made small talk about how busy downtown gets on weekends, and he asked if I was enjoying college. He seemed genuinely interested in my psychology major, and even mentioned that his daughter was thinking about studying the same thing. The conversation was pleasant enough that I almost dozed off, lulled by the warm car and the gentle hum of the engine. But then I noticed we were heading toward the industrial part of town instead of taking the usual route back to campus. I sat up straighter and glanced at my phone, trying to open the app to check our location, but the screen went black, completely dead. "Excuse me," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "I think we might be going the wrong way. The university is back toward downtown." That's when everything changed. His eyes in the rearview mirror weren't kind anymore. "We're taking a little detour," he said, and his voice had completely shifted from friendly to flat and emotionless. The politeness was gone, replaced by something that made my skin crawl. I tried to stay calm, telling myself maybe there was construction or an accident blocking the main road, but deep down I knew this wasn't right. "I really need to get back to campus," I said, my voice coming out higher than I intended. "I have an early class tomorrow." He didn't respond. Instead, he reached over and I heard a distinct clicking sound. The automatic door locks engaging. The sound echoed in the quiet car like a gunshot, and suddenly the vanilla air freshener smell seemed overwhelming, almost suffocating. I grabbed the door handle and pulled, but nothing happened. We were now driving through a part of town I'd never seen before, past empty warehouses and chain-link fences topped with razor wire. The silence in the car became deafening except for the sound of my own breathing, which was getting faster and shallower by the second. I tried to think rationally, remembering everything I'd learned in my abnormal psychology class about crisis situations and how to stay calm under pressure. But my mind was racing and I could feel panic starting to creep up my throat like bile. "Listen, if this is about money, I can pay you extra," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I just want to go home." He glanced at me in the mirror again, and this time I saw something in his expression that made my entire body tense up. It wasn't anger or greed. It was anticipation, like he was enjoying this. The car slowed down as we approached a deserted intersection, and I realized we were now in a completely industrial area, where there wouldn't be any witnesses or help for miles. "You know what your problem is?" he said suddenly, his voice taking on an almost conversational tone that was somehow worse than the silence. "You kids today, you're too trusting. You just hop into any car without checking." My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. That's when it hit me. I never checked the license plate. In my rush to get out of the cold, I just assumed the first black car that showed up was mine. How could I have been so stupid? I started looking around frantically for anything I could use as a weapon or a way to signal for help, but the car was spotless except for a small pine tree air freshener hanging from the mirror. The windows were tinted too dark for anyone outside to see in, even if there had been anyone around to see. My palms were sweating as I tried the door handle again, pulling harder this time, but the locks held firm. We turned down another empty street, this one lined with abandoned buildings and overgrown lots. The streetlights were few and far between, casting long shadows that seemed to reach into the car. "Where are we going?" I asked, abandoning any pretense of politeness. My voice was shaking now, and I didn't care if he could hear how scared I was. "Please just let me out. I won't tell anyone about this. I'll say you dropped me off where you were supposed to." He laughed then, a sound that made every hair on my arm stand up. It wasn't a normal laugh, it was the kind of sound someone makes when they know something you don't, when they're holding all the cards. "Oh, but we're almost there," he said, glancing at me in the mirror again. "Just a little further now." The dashboard clock read 2:23 a.m., and I realized that even if someone noticed I was missing, they wouldn't start looking for hours. That's when I remembered the emergency whistle on my keychain, a gift from my paranoid mom when I started college. My keys were buried in my purse, and I knew I had to be smart about this. I started slowly digging through my bag, trying to look like I was just searching for lip balm or something innocent. The car was slowing down even more now, and I could see what looked like an old warehouse up ahead with a single flickering light above a loading dock. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to do something, anything, before we stopped completely. My fingers finally found the whistle, and I wrapped my hand around it, keeping it hidden. "You seem nervous," he said, watching me in the mirror. "Don't be. This will all be over soon." Those words sent ice through my veins, and I knew I was running out of time. The car turned into the parking lot of the warehouse, gravel crunching under the tires. As soon as he put the car in park, I made my move. I brought the whistle to my lips and blew as hard as I could, the shrill sound piercing the quiet night air. At the same time, I started kicking the window with my heeled boots, not caring if I broke my ankle in the process. "Help! Somebody help me!" I screamed between whistle blasts. The driver spun around, his face contorted with rage, and lunged toward the back seat. But in his anger, he must have hit something because suddenly all the doors unlocked with a loud click. I didn't hesitate. I threw myself out of the car and ran toward the street, my heels clicking frantically on the asphalt. Behind me, I could hear him getting out of the car, shouting something I couldn't make out over the sound of my own panicked breathing. The whistle was still in my hand, and I kept blowing it as I ran, hoping someone, anyone, would hear it and call for help. I could hear his footsteps behind me, but they were getting fainter as I put distance between us. My lungs were burning and my feet were killing me in those stupid heels, but adrenaline kept me moving. Then, like a miracle, I saw headlights coming down the main road about 2 blocks away. I ran straight toward them, waving my arms and screaming, not caring how crazy I looked. It was a delivery truck, probably heading to one of the 24-hour diners across town. The driver saw me and pulled over, rolling down his window with a concerned expression. "Miss, are you okay? What happened?" I was sobbing and could barely get the words out, but I managed to tell him someone had tried to kidnap me and to please call 911. He immediately grabbed his radio and started talking to his dispatcher, while I collapsed against the side of his truck, finally allowing myself to fall apart. When I looked back toward the warehouse, the black car was gone. The whole area was empty again, like nothing had happened. The police arrived within 10 minutes, followed by an ambulance, even though I insisted I wasn't hurt. They took my statement and searched the warehouse area, but found nothing except some tire tracks in the gravel. The officer told me I'd done everything right, making noise, fighting back, and getting to safety as quickly as possible. They never caught the guy, and the real rideshare driver Michael showed up at the bar 20 minutes after I'd already left, confused about why his passenger wasn't there. Apparently, my ride had been sitting there waiting while I was getting into a completely different car. The app showed he had the right license plate number ending in 847, while I never even thought to check. I learned later that this kind of thing happens more often than people realize. Predators watching for drunk college students and pulling up right when rideshares are supposed to arrive. I still use rideshare apps, but now I'm obsessive about checking license plates, and I never get in a car until I've confirmed the driver's name and photo match exactly. That whistle is still on my keychain, and my phone is always charged before I go out. Sometimes I think about how different that night could have ended if my mom hadn't been so paranoid about my safety. The whole thing started on a Tuesday evening in late July 2019. I'm a single mom to my 16-year-old son Tyler, and we live in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Milwaukee. At the time, I was a nurse at the local hospital, pulling long shifts and trying to balance everything on my own since my divorce 2 years earlier. Tyler was a good kid, honor roll student, played basketball, never gave me much trouble. He had this friend named Ethan who'd been coming around for about 6 months. Ethan was polite enough, always said, "Yes, ma'am," and "No, ma'am." But there was something about him that I couldn't quite put my finger on. He was tall for his age, maybe 17, with sandy brown hair that always appeared disheveled, like he'd just run his fingers through it. His clothes were always clean but worn, like they'd been washed too many times. There was this way he'd watch people when he thought they weren't paying attention. Not obvious, just these quick glances that lasted a second too long. I'd just gotten home from a particularly brutal 12-hour shift at the hospital. We'd lost 2 patients that day, and I was emotionally drained. All I wanted was to microwave some leftover pasta and collapse on the couch with a glass of wine. The house was quiet when I walked in, which was unusual because Tyler usually had music playing or was on his PlayStation. I called out his name as I dropped my purse on the kitchen counter, and he appeared from the living room with Ethan trailing behind him. Both boys had this subdued energy about them, like they'd been having a serious conversation. Tyler's face was flushed, and Ethan kept shifting his weight from one foot to the other, his eyes darting between me and the floor. "Mom," Tyler started, his voice carrying that tone kids use when they're about to ask for something big. "Ethan had a really bad fight with his parents tonight. His dad threw some of his stuff out on the lawn." The way Ethan stood there, almost hunched into himself, made my heart ache a little. He wasn't crying, but there was this defeated slump to his shoulders that reminded me of a kicked dog. His usual neat appearance was slightly disheveled. His t-shirt had a small tear near the collar, and there was a faint bruise on his forearm that hadn't been there the last time I'd seen him. "Can he stay here tonight?" Tyler continued, his voice getting more confident as he spoke. "Just until things cool down at home. He doesn't have anywhere else to go." Ethan finally looked up at me then, and I saw something in his dark brown eyes that made me want to say yes immediately. It wasn't just sadness, it was this raw vulnerability that teenagers try so hard to hide. He opened his mouth like he was going to say something, then closed it again, clearly uncomfortable with having to ask for help. The silence stretched between us for what felt like forever, and I could hear the kitchen clock ticking loudly on the wall. My maternal instincts kicked in hard. Here was a kid who clearly needed help, and my own son was asking me to provide it. What kind of person would I be if I turned him away? "Of course you can stay," I said, and I watched the relief wash across both boys' faces. Ethan's shoulders dropped like he'd been holding his breath, and Tyler actually smiled for the first time since I'd gotten home. "Thank you so much, Mrs. Johnson," Ethan said, his voice quiet but sincere. "I really appreciate it. I promise I won't be any trouble." There was something about the way he said it, so formal, so carefully polite, that struck me as odd. Most teenagers would have been more casual, maybe even a little embarrassed about needing help. But Ethan spoke like he was delivering a prepared speech, each word chosen carefully. I brushed the thought aside, telling myself I was overthinking things because I was tired. The kid needed a safe place to sleep, and that's what mattered. I set Ethan up on the couch in our living room with some spare blankets and a pillow from the linen closet. He thanked me again, that same overly polite tone, and settled in like he was afraid to take up too much space. The boys hung out for a while, playing video games and talking quietly, their voices a comfortable murmur in the background while I finally ate my reheated pasta. Around 10 o'clock, I told them both it was time to wind down. I had another early shift the next morning, and Tyler had summer school. Ethan immediately stood up and started organizing the blankets, making sure everything was perfectly neat. "I'll be super quiet," he assured me, smoothing down the couch cushions with an almost obsessive precision. "You won't even know I'm here." The way he said it, with such earnest intensity, made me feel guilty for even thinking there was anything strange about his behavior. This was just a scared kid trying to be the perfect houseguest. I went upstairs around 11, brushing my teeth and changing into my pajamas while listening to the sounds of the house settling for the night. Tyler's room was right next to mine, and I could hear him moving around, probably getting ready for bed too. The house grew quiet, except for the usual creaks and sighs that old houses make. I remember lying in bed, staring at the ceiling and thinking about how proud I was of Tyler for wanting to help his friend. It showed real character, real compassion. I must have drifted off sometime after midnight, exhausted from the long day. But around 3 in the morning, something woke me up. It wasn't a loud noise, more like a soft thudding sound, like someone walking carefully but not quite carefully enough. I lay there in the darkness, my ears straining to identify what I'd heard. The sound came again, definitely footsteps, but they were coming from downstairs. I assumed Ethan was just getting water or using the bathroom, so I rolled over and tried to go back to sleep. But the footsteps didn't stop. They continued for what must have been 10 or 15 minutes, a slow, deliberate pattern that didn't match someone just getting a drink of water. It sounded like whoever was down there was moving methodically from room to room. I told myself it was probably just Ethan having trouble sleeping, maybe walking around to tire himself out. Teenage boys do weird things sometimes, right? Still, there was something about the rhythm of those footsteps that made me uneasy. They would pause for long stretches, then resume, like someone was stopping to examine things carefully before moving on. I listened harder, trying to convince myself it was nothing, but the pattern was too deliberate, too purposeful. Around 3:30, the footsteps finally stopped, and I heard what sounded like the couch springs creaking as someone settled back down. I waited another few minutes, my heart beating a little faster than normal, before exhaustion finally pulled me back under. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee brewing downstairs. When I made it to the kitchen, Ethan was already dressed and had apparently made a full pot. "Good morning, Mrs. Johnson," he said with that same polite smile. "I hope you don't mind that I made coffee. I wanted to do something to thank you for letting me stay." He was wearing the same clothes from the night before, but somehow they appeared freshly pressed, and his hair was combed back neatly. Tyler stumbled down a few minutes later, still in his pajamas and clearly not fully awake yet. "Dude, you're up early," he mumbled to Ethan, who just shrugged and said he was always an early riser. I poured myself a cup of coffee and had to admit it was perfectly brewed. Not too strong, not too weak. Ethan declined my offer of cereal or toast, saying he wasn't much of a breakfast person. He gathered his things quietly and efficiently, thanking me again with that same formal politeness that had struck me as odd the night before. "I really can't tell you how much this meant to me," he said, shaking my hand like we were closing a business deal. It wasn't until later that afternoon, after I'd gotten home from another long shift, that I started noticing things. I went to grab some cash from my wallet to order pizza for dinner, and I could have sworn I'd had 3 20s in there the night before. Now there were only 2. I stood in my bedroom, staring at my wallet and trying to remember if I'd spent that 20 somewhere and just forgotten about it. It was possible. I'd been exhausted lately, and sometimes I bought coffee or grabbed lunch without really thinking about it, but the nagging feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. I checked my purse more thoroughly and realized my emergency credit card, the one I kept for absolute emergencies, was missing entirely. My heart started pounding as I dumped everything out of my purse onto the bed, searching through receipts and loose change. The card was definitely gone. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it had fallen out somewhere, maybe I'd left it at the hospital. But combined with the missing cash, a terrible suspicion was starting to form in my mind. Then I remembered my prescription bottles. I keep them in the medicine cabinet in my bathroom. Nothing major, just my anxiety medication that I take occasionally when work gets overwhelming, and some leftover pain pills from when I'd hurt my back a few months earlier. I rushed to the bathroom and opened the cabinet, my heart racing as I counted the pills. The anxiety medication bottle was completely empty. I knew for certain there had been at least 15 pills left because I'd just picked up the prescription the week before. The pain medication was missing too, not the whole bottle, but about half the pills were gone. I sat down hard on the edge of my bathtub, the reality of what had happened hitting me like a physical blow. Someone had been in my house, in my personal space, taking my things while I slept just feet away. And that someone was a teenager I'd welcomed into my home out of kindness. The violation of trust was almost worse than the actual theft. I'd opened my door to what I thought was a kid in trouble, and instead I'd let in someone who'd systematically robbed me while I was unconscious and vulnerable. But the worst discovery was still to come. We have a basic security system that records footage from cameras around the house. Nothing fancy. Just something the previous owners had installed that I'd never bothered to change. I'd completely forgotten about it until that moment. With trembling fingers, I pulled up the app on my phone and scrolled back to the previous night. What I saw made my entire body go cold. There was Ethan, clearly visible in the infrared footage, moving through my house at 3:17 a.m. He wasn't stumbling around like someone who was disoriented or looking for the bathroom. His movements were deliberate, calculated. I watched in horror as he systematically went through my kitchen drawers, opened cabinets, and even rifled through the mail on my counter. The footage showed him going upstairs, actually walking past the bathroom and heading straight for my bedroom. I could see him standing in my doorway for what felt like an eternity, just watching me sleep. Then he moved to my dresser, carefully going through my jewelry box and taking what he wanted. The timestamp showed he was in my room for almost 20 minutes while I was completely unaware. The final piece of evidence came when I decided to vacuum the living room where he'd slept. I moved the couch cushions to clean underneath, and that's when I found it. A kitchen knife from my own knife block, carefully hidden between the couch cushions where he'd been sleeping. It was one of my sharp carving knives, and it had been deliberately placed there, not accidentally dropped. The implications hit me like a freight train. This wasn't just about theft. He'd armed himself while he was in my house. I realized that those late-night footsteps hadn't just been him exploring and stealing. He'd been preparing for something potentially much worse. The knife proved that his polite, grateful demeanor had been a complete facade. I immediately called the police and filed a report, giving them all the evidence I had. They told me cases like this were becoming more common. Teenagers who specifically targeted single mothers, knowing they were more likely to take in a kid in trouble. Ethan was arrested 3 days later when he tried to use my credit card at a gas station. Turns out he had a history of this exact scam, and I was just the latest in a string of victims. I never saw him again after that morning, and Tyler was devastated when he learned the truth about his so-called friend. When you're working long shifts and barely have energy left to microwave dinner, the last thing you expect is to come home to silence that feels too intentional. Back then, I was living in a small 2-bedroom house just outside of Huntsville, Alabama. I'd been working IT support for a manufacturing company, mostly remote, and spent a lot of time alone since my divorce a year earlier. The second bedroom had become a graveyard for unopened Amazon boxes and a half-assembled elliptical I kept promising to use. It wasn't much, but it was quiet, predictable, safe. It was one of the younger guys from work, Marcus, who mentioned his cousin had just separated from her husband and was scrambling for a place to land. He made it sound casual, like she just needed a temporary setup for a few weeks. Said her name was Jenna. I asked a few basic questions: age, job, whether she had pets, and he assured me she was easygoing, clean, and just needed some time to figure things out. I hesitated. I'm not the type to bring strangers into my space, but Marcus had always been decent, and something about the way he said she's been through hell made me pause. I told him to give her my number. Jenna texted that same night, very polite, punctuation and everything. Said she was grateful, wouldn't be a burden, and could chip in for groceries if I wanted. We agreed on a move-in date that weekend. When she showed up, it was just her and 2 suitcases. She looked younger than I expected, maybe early 30s, with dark blonde hair tied in a loose braid and a heavy, oversized hoodie despite the heat. Her eyes scanned the hallway when she walked in, not curious exactly, but focused, like she was quietly cataloging things. She didn't talk much. Said thank you several times, and after a brief tour, she disappeared into the spare room and shut the door softly behind her. The first week was normal, maybe a little too quiet, but I chalked it up to her going through emotional stuff. She kept to herself, was always gone in the mornings before I logged on for work, and never brought anyone over. Sometimes I'd hear her walking around late at night, or the microwave humming at weird hours, but nothing alarming. If anything, I felt relief that she wasn't messy or loud. Then small things started to shift. A pair of scissors I always kept in the junk drawer were gone. A half-full shampoo bottle in my bathroom was replaced with a new one. Same brand, but I hadn't bought it. My favorite coffee mug, the one with the chipped rim from college, vanished completely. At first I thought I was just misplacing stuff. Stress, maybe. It wasn't until I opened my fridge one evening and found my labeled container of leftover chili, the one I'd specifically planned for lunch the next day, completely gone, that I started keeping mental notes. I didn't want to accuse her of anything, not without being sure, so I let it slide and made a sandwich. But a couple days later, the light in the hallway closet was on when I came home, and the attic hatch in the ceiling was slightly ajar. That one really threw me. I hadn't touched that hatch in over a year, and I definitely wouldn't have left it like that. I asked Jenna about it the next morning. She gave me this quick blink, then said, "Oh, I didn't even know there was an attic," and returned to her room. Her tone was casual, but she didn't ask any questions about it. Didn't seem curious at all. That bugged me more than the hatch itself. A few nights later, I walked past her room and noticed her door was open a crack. The light was on, and I could hear something, as not a video or music, but faint whispering. It stopped the moment I paused. I figured she was on a call and kept walking, trying not to be that guy who eavesdrops in his own hallway. But the next morning, I noticed something odd on the kitchen table: a photograph. It was one of my family, me, my sister, and my niece at a pumpkin patch, taken maybe 2 years earlier. It hadn't been there the night before, and I definitely hadn't put it out. I kept all my old photos in a plastic bin in the hall closet. This one had a faint smudge on the edge, like it had been touched with damp fingers. I put it back in the bin without saying anything. 2 days later, I came home from work and Jenna was sitting at the dining table looking at her phone. She turned it face down when I walked in, like a reflex. I said, "Hey." She said, "Hey." Normal stuff. But when she got up to go to the kitchen, she left the phone behind. I don't know what came over me, but I glanced at the screen. Notifications were still showing, and there, plain as day, was a thumbnail of the same pumpkin patch photo. Then another, a shot of my parents' backyard. Then one from my high school graduation party. These weren't on my social media. I'd never scanned or posted any of them. My throat went dry. I tapped the screen. The app was just her gallery. They were saved, stored. When she came back into the room, I tried to act normal, but I couldn't keep my voice steady. I asked her, flat out, "Why do you have photos of my family on your phone?" Jenna blinked like she hadn't heard me at first. Then she said slowly, "I don't." "What are you talking about?" I picked up the phone and turned it toward her. The screen had locked. I pressed the power button. It asked for a passcode. She didn't reach for it, just looked at me and said, "I think you're tired. You've been working a lot." And that was it. She walked into her room and locked the door behind her. That night I barely slept. Every sound, creaking floorboards, distant hums from the fridge, even the wind brushing against the windows, felt amplified. Around 3 a.m. I got up and went into the hallway. Her door was still closed, no light underneath, but I noticed something that stopped me cold. The attic hatch was open again, wider this time. I stood there staring up at the square of darkness, trying to decide whether I was going to be brave or smart. I chose neither. I backed into my room, locked the door, and pushed a chair under the knob. I don't care how paranoid that sounds. I wasn't about to investigate my own attic in the middle of the night while someone who'd lied to me about family photos was living down the hall. The next morning, she was already gone. Not just out for coffee, gone. Her room was half empty. The bed was stripped. One suitcase was missing. The closet door was ajar, and inside were a few things she clearly didn't care about. A pair of flip-flops, a stained hoodie, an empty tote bag. I opened the top drawer of the dresser and found a folded piece of notebook paper. No name, no message, just a single line written in shaky handwriting. "You didn't lock it fast enough." I didn't know what it meant. Still don't. I checked the attic after she left, climbed up with my phone light shaking in my hand. There were candy wrappers, a throw blanket, and one of my old hoodies up there. Like she'd been spending time inside. For how long, I have no idea. I called Marcus. He was as shocked as I was. Said he hadn't talked to Jenna in over a year, not since she got weird after the divorce. When I told him everything, he got quiet, then said, "Dude, her name's not Jenna. Her real name's Emily." Jenna was the ex-wife. I asked him what he meant, and he explained the cousin's ex had started using her name online after the separation. Claimed she wanted a fresh start and didn't want to be found by her ex-husband. That's what she'd told Marcus's aunt when she reached out last year. Said she'd been through something traumatic. No one knew exactly what. She just bounced from place to place, never staying long. I changed the locks that same afternoon. Got cameras installed around the house the next day. I don't use that spare room anymore. I keep the door shut and don't store anything in there. Nothing's gone missing since, and no strange photos have shown up, but I still check the attic hatch every night before I go to bed, just in case. I never figured out how she got those pictures or what else she'd done while I was working in the other room. All I know is I let someone in without really knowing who they were. And she didn't just move in. She settled in like she belonged there, like she'd been waiting for someone to leave a door open. Running a bed and breakfast in small-town Maine wasn't exactly the dream life I'd imagined when I inherited Grandma's Victorian house 5 years ago. At 34, I'd been managing the Willowbrook Inn mostly by myself since my divorce. trying to keep the place afloat with weekend tourists and the occasional business traveler. Most days were predictable: fresh linens, continental breakfast, polite small talk with guests who'd be gone by Sunday. That was until September 2021, when everything changed because of one particular guest who walked through my front door on a humid Thursday evening, carrying nothing but a worn leather duffel bag and enough cash to pay for 3 months up front. Helen Carpenter introduced herself with the kind of soft-spoken politeness that immediately put me at ease. She appeared to be in her late 40s, with graying brown hair pulled back in a neat bun, and clothes that looked expensive but understated. The kind of woman you'd expect to see volunteering at a library or teaching piano lessons. She explained that she was going through a difficult transition period and needed somewhere quiet to stay while she figured out her next steps. The way she spoke, with careful pauses between words, suggested someone who'd been through something traumatic but was trying to maintain composure. When she placed $3,600 in crisp hundreds on my reception desk, asking for the corner room on the second floor for 12 weeks, I didn't hesitate to say yes. Business had been slow, and frankly, the guaranteed income was exactly what I needed to cover the upcoming roof repairs. The first few weeks with Helen were blissfully uneventful. She kept to herself, rarely emerging from room 7 except for brief trips to the kitchen around midnight to make tea. I'd installed a small kitchenette on each floor years ago, and she seemed to appreciate the privacy it afforded her. During the day, I'd hear the faint sound of classical music drifting from her room, always the same piece, something melancholy that I couldn't quite identify. She never ate the continental breakfast I prepared, never sat on the wrap-around porch like other guests, never even asked about local attractions. The only evidence of her presence was the occasional soft footsteps above the ceiling of my first-floor apartment, and the way she'd nod politely whenever we passed in the hallway, her pale blue eyes never quite meeting mine. Everything started to shift in early December when the weekend guests began arriving for the holiday season. The Hendersons, a retired couple from Boston, were the first to mention something unusual. Mrs. Henderson approached me Saturday morning while I was arranging fresh flowers in the lobby, her normally cheerful demeanor replaced by obvious discomfort. She spoke in hushed tones about hearing voices from the room next to theirs, room 7, at 3 in the morning, what sounded like a conversation between two people, though she'd only ever seen Helen going in and out. When I suggested it might have been the television, Mrs. Henderson shook her head firmly, insisting that she'd heard distinct voices having what sounded like an argument, with Helen's soft tone occasionally interrupted by something much deeper and more aggressive. The conversation lasted nearly an hour, she claimed, before ending abruptly with the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. I dismissed Mrs. Henderson's concerns with practiced hospitality, explaining that old houses carry sound in strange ways, and that Helen was probably just watching late-night movies. But deep down, something nagged at me because I'd noticed Helen's midnight kitchen visits had become more frequent, and she'd started carrying what looked like large Tupperware containers back to her room. When I casually asked if she needed additional refrigerator space, she'd simply smiled that same polite smile and assured me everything was fine. The following week brought the Yamamoto family, who complained about a persistent, sweet, cloying smell that seemed strongest near room 7, a smell they described as like flowers left too long in water but worse. I'd walked the hallway myself multiple times, detecting only the faintest trace of something that might have been overly ripe fruit, or perhaps an air freshener that had gone stale. The complaints intensified as more guests cycled through the inn. The Millers mentioned their bathroom toiletries going missing, expensive shampoo, and a bottle of prescription medication that had simply vanished overnight. The Kowalski couple reported strange scratching sounds coming from inside the walls of room 6, directly adjacent to Helen's room, sounds that continued intermittently throughout their entire stay. Most disturbing was the incident with the Patels, who'd booked the room across the hall from Helen. Mr. Patel approached me on their checkout morning, clearly agitated, describing how his wife had witnessed a figure standing motionless in Helen's doorway at 4 a.m., just watching their door for what felt like an eternity before retreating back into the room. When Mrs. Patel had gotten up to use the bathroom an hour later, she'd found wet footprints leading from Helen's room down the hall to the shared bathroom, though the prints didn't match any normal shoe pattern. They looked more like bare feet, but elongated and somehow wrong. By January, I was losing bookings. Word travels fast in small communities, and guests were leaving reviews mentioning disturbing disturbances and unsettling atmosphere. I knew I needed to address the situation, but every time I approached Helen's door, I'd find myself making excuses to walk away. The rational part of my mind kept insisting that she was just a harmless woman going through a difficult time, and the guaranteed rent money had become essential to keeping the inn operational. Helen herself remained polite during our rare encounters, though I noticed she'd lost considerable weight, and her skin had taken on an almost translucent quality. When she did speak, her voice had developed a slight rasp, and she had a habit of licking her lips frequently, as if they were perpetually dry. Most unnervingly, she'd started asking odd questions about the other guests, when they usually went to bed, whether they were heavy sleepers, if they traveled with valuable items. The breaking point came on a particularly cold Wednesday in mid-January, when I woke at dawn to find the police at my front door. Officer Bradley Thompson, whom I'd known since high school, looked grim as he explained that they'd received reports from multiple sources about suspicious activity at the inn. Apparently, Mrs. Henderson had called from Boston after remembering additional details about her stay. She'd seen Helen in the parking lot one night, standing next to a guest's car with what appeared to be a key, though she hadn't thought much of it at the time. The Yamamoto family had also contacted authorities after discovering that their credit card information had been compromised shortly after their stay, with fraudulent charges appearing within days of checkout. Officer Thompson asked if I'd noticed anything unusual about Helen's behavior, and as I stood there in my bathrobe, listing off months of strange incidents I'd rationalized away, I realized how foolish I'd been to ignore every single warning sign. After the police left with promises to return later that day for a formal interview, I knew I couldn't delay confronting the situation any longer. I climbed the stairs to the second floor, my master key trembling in my palm as I approached room 7. The hallway reeked of that sweet rotting smell the guests had complained about, so intense now that it made my eyes water. I knocked softly, calling Helen's name, but received no response. The silence stretched on unnaturally. No classical music, no footsteps, not even the sound of breathing. When I finally turned the key and pushed open the door, the smell hit me like a physical wall, forcing me to cover my nose with my sleeve. The room was completely empty of personal belongings, as if Helen had never been there at all, except for several large plastic containers stacked neatly in the corner, each one sealed with duct tape and labeled with dates spanning the past 4 months. What I discovered when I opened the first container still haunts my dreams every single night. Inside were dozens of driver's licenses, credit cards, and personal items that I recognized from previous guests. Mrs. Miller's prescription bottle, Mr. Kowalski's expensive watch, jewelry that had belonged to at least 6 different women who'd stayed at the inn. But underneath these stolen belongings was something far worse. Photographs. Hundreds of photographs taken through windows, showing guests sleeping, undressing, showering. Intimate moments captured without their knowledge. Each photo was meticulously labeled with names, room numbers, and what appeared to be personal information Helen had somehow gathered about each victim. The second container held even more disturbing evidence. Detailed notes about guests' routines, copies of their room keys, and what looked like credit card readers and other devices I didn't recognize. But it was the third container that made me understand the true horror of what had been happening under my own roof. Inside were items of clothing, underwear, and personal effects that could only have been taken from guests while they slept, along with vials of what looked like hair and nail clippings, all organized with the same obsessive precision. I called Officer Thompson immediately, my voice shaking as I tried to explain what I'd found. Within an hour, The inn was swarming with investigators, forensic specialists, and detectives who treated the entire second floor as a crime scene. The investigation revealed that Helen Carpenter was actually Beverly Walsh, a woman with a lengthy criminal history involving identity theft, stalking, and breaking and entering across multiple states. She'd been using my inn as a base of operations, systematically victimizing every guest who stayed there, gathering enough personal information to steal their identities and sell their private photos on dark websites. The most chilling discovery came when they examined the walls of room 7. She'd drilled tiny holes into the adjoining rooms, creating an elaborate surveillance network that allowed her to watch and photograph guests without detection. The scratching sounds the Kowalski couple had heard weren't coming from inside the walls. They were the sounds of Beverly moving through crawl spaces she'd created, accessing different rooms to plant cameras and steal belongings while people slept. The aftermath was devastating for my business and my sense of security. 23 former guests came forward as victims, and I faced multiple lawsuits for failing to protect their privacy and safety. The inn had to be completely renovated to remove all of Beverly's modifications, costing me nearly everything I had saved. She was eventually arrested 3 states away, caught using stolen credit cards from my guests, and sentenced to 15 years in prison. What haunts me most isn't just the violation of my guests' trust, but my own willful blindness to the obvious signs. I'd prioritized easy money over the safety of people who'd trusted me with their most vulnerable moments, sleeping in what they believed was a secure space. The Willowbrook Inn closed permanently 6 months later, and I moved to a small apartment in town, but I still wake up some nights thinking about those photographs, wondering how many other innkeepers, landlords, or property managers have made the same terrible choice I did, choosing financial stability over doing what's right when every instinct screams that something is wrong.